Imagine this. It's October 31st, 1501. Inside the Vatican, beneath sacred frescoes of saints and angels, Pope Alexander VI and his family preside over a night so scandalous, so blasphemous, that even the most corrupt rulers of ancient Rome would have shuddered in shame. This is the story of the Banquet of Chestnuts, the night the Vatican became Babylon. Section 1. Shadows in the Vatican. The marble columns of the Vatican rose like silent sentinels, their polished surfaces glowing faintly in the flickering light of hundreds of candles. The scent of incense clung to the air, mingled with something richer, more carnal, a heady perfume of wine, roasted meats, and sweat. It was October 31st, 1501, and the city of Rome, draped in autumn mist, lay quiet beneath a silver moon. But within these sacred walls, a storm of desire and ambition was about to erupt. You crouched low behind one of those towering columns, your breast shallow, your heart a frantic drumbeat in your chest. You had no right to be here, no mortal did, not even the most exalted cardinal. Yet somehow, fate had guided your steps through winding corridors, past distracted guards whose pockets jingled with gold bribes, until you found yourself here, in the Pope's private apartments, witnessing what no soul would dare confess even in whispered prayer. The air trembled with a strange tension, as though the ancient stones themselves recoiled at what they were about to witness. Shadows danced along the frescoed walls, painted scenes of saints and angels now staring down with silent horror. And through the grand hall ahead, laughter drifted, low, rich, wicked laughter, like a chorus of demons mocking the heavens. A servant scurried past, carrying a silver tray piled high with roasted chestnuts, their shells cracking in the heat. The smell was sweet and earthy, but tonight these humble nuts would serve a darker purpose. Tonight, they would become instruments of humiliation, scattered across the floor of this holy palace for a game of depravity that would echo through history. The voice of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, carried above the murmurs of the crowd. Smooth, commanding, edged with cruelty, it sent a chill down your spine. Tonight, he proclaimed, lifting a goblet of wine high, we cast aside the masks of piety. No prayers, no confessions, no judgment. Only truth, our truth. His words were met with a roar of approval from the assembled nobles and courtesans. And there, seated upon a throne-like chair beneath the papal crest, was the Vicar of Christ himself, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI. His eyes, dark and glittering, surveyed the gathering like a predator assessing its prey. He was old, yes, his face lined by years of indulgence and scheming, but his presence filled the room with an almost supernatural weight. Beside him sat his daughter, Lucrezia, her golden hair cascading like sunlight, her expression unreadable. Some whispered she was a victim of her father's ambitions, others claimed she was his willing accomplice. Your breath caught as the music swelled and the first courtesans entered, their silken gowns gleaming like jewels. The stage was set. The night of the Banquet of Chestnuts had begun. Section 2. The Pope's Rise. To understand the depth of this corruption, you must journey back decades, to a dusty Spanish town called Zataiva, near Valencia, where Rodrigo Borgia first drew breath on January 1, 1431. The child of a minor noble family, Rodrigo's early life gave no hint of the power he would one day wield. Yet even then, there was a hunger in him, a restless fire that drove him to seek more than a simple existence. It was his uncle, Alfonso de Borja, who would shape Rodrigo's destiny. Alfonso rose steadily within the church, using wit and political cunning to outmaneuver rivals. When he was elected Pope Calixtus III in 1455, the young Rodrigo's future was sealed. At just 25 years old, Rodrigo was appointed cardinal deacon, a position not won through divine calling but through the ancient poison of nepotism. When Rodrigo first arrived in Rome, the Eternal City was a paradox of splendor and rot. By day, pilgrims filled the streets, their voices lifted in prayer. By night, those same streets ran red with blood as rival noble families battled for dominance, and brothels did brisk trade beneath the shadow of basilicas. Rome was a city of masks, where piety was a performance, and sin a currency. Rodrigo adapted quickly. With a sharp mind and sharper instincts, he built a network of alliances, buying loyalty with gold and promises. He accumulated wealth through the careful manipulation of ecclesiastical benefices, siphoning revenues from distant dioceses like a spider drawing sustenance from its web. His palaces were filled with luxuries, his banquets rivaled those of secular kings, and his bed was rarely empty. Among his many mistresses, one stood above the rest, Venazia de Catania, a Roman noblewoman as ambitious as she was beautiful. Their union produced 4 children, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Each child was a pawn in Rodrigo's grand game of power, though some, like Cesare, would later become players in their own right. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's behavior scandalized Rome. Pope Pius II once rebuked him publicly for conduct so disgraceful it shocked even the decadent Roman court. But shame was a luxury Rodrigo could not afford. He had his eyes set on the papal throne, and nothing, not morality, not rivals, not God himself, would deter him. Section 3. The Conclave of Shadows. The summer of 1492 was suffocatingly hot. Rome sweltered beneath a pitiless sun as rumors swirled about the impending conclave. Pope Innocent VIII lay dead, and the cardinals gathered to elect a successor. The Sistine Chapel, not yet graced by Michelangelo's immortal frescoes, became a theater of intrigue. Rodrigo moved through the gathering like a serpent, his voice honeyed, his offers irresistible. Gold changed hands in secret alcoves. Promises were whispered like prayers. Entire dioceses were traded as bargaining chips. Simony, the buying and selling of sacred offices, was not merely suspected. It was the very foundation of this conclave. On August 11, 1492, the white smoke rose at last. Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious, taking the name Alexander VI. The crowds of Rome erupted in celebration, for they knew this man. He had charmed them, dazzled them, and they anticipated a reign of magnificence and stability. Torchlight processions filled the streets, bonfires blazed, and triumphal arches were hastily erected to honor the new pontiff. Alexander began his papacy with reforms that seemed almost virtuous. He cracked down on rampant street violence, personally presiding over judicial hearings every Tuesday. For a brief moment, it seemed as though divine providence had guided the choice. But power, like wine, does not change a man, it reveals him. Soon, Alexander's focus shifted to his children, particularly Juan and Cesare. Juan was elevated to Duke of Gandia and given command of papal armies despite lacking military skill. Cesare, only 18, was made Archbishop of Valencia and later a cardinal, a role he accepted reluctantly, for his true ambitions lay elsewhere. As Alexander's grip tightened, the papal apartments became a stage for opulence and vice. Banquets glittered with gold and jewels, while the line between sacred ritual and profane indulgence blurred. Julia Farnese, the Pope's mistress, known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella, walked the Vatican halls like a queen. Cardinals who dared to protest soon found themselves exiled, or dead. Section 4. The Death of Juan. By 1497, cracks began to show in the Borgia Empire. Juan, the favored son, had proven himself incompetent and cruel. His military campaigns ended in disaster, and his debauchery scandalized even his father's court. Whispers grew louder. Perhaps Cesare, the more capable brother, resented Juan's favored status. On a warm June evening, Juan attended a lavish feast. Hours later, his body was found floating in the Tiber, riddled with stab wounds. Rome erupted in rumor. Some blamed rival families, others suspected Cesare himself. The Pope's grief was legendary. For 3 days, Alexander locked himself away, refusing food or sleep. When he finally emerged, his face was hollow, his voice trembling with rage and sorrow. "I will cleanse this court," he vowed before the cardinals. "The corruption ends now." For a brief moment, it seemed tragedy might inspire true reform. Alexander announced sweeping measures: restrictions on luxury, the elimination of simony, the cleansing of the Vatican's moral rot. A commission was formed to draft ordinances that would echo the reforms of the future Council of Trent. But grief fades, and ambition endures. Within months, the Pope's vows were forgotten, buried beneath new schemes. Cesare stepped into the void left by Juan's death, shedding his cardinal's robes to pursue military glory. The Pope's heart, once devoted to his lost son, now beat solely for Cesare, the sharp blade through which the Borgia dream would be carved into history. Section 5. Cesare's Awakening. Cesare Borgia stood at the window of his private chambers, staring out over the labyrinthine streets of Rome. The city stretched before him like a living beast, breathing smoke and secrets. Somewhere beneath that dark expanse, his brother Juan's blood had mingled with the filthy waters of the Tiber. Cesare's reflection glimmered faintly in the glass, a face both striking and cold, a predator in the making. "You were weak, Juan," he murmured to the empty room. "And weakness has no place in our family's empire." Behind him, the heavy oak door creaked open, and Pope Alexander VI entered, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. His eyes, red-rimmed from recent grief, fixed on his remaining son. "Cesare," he said, his voice hoarse, "the time for mourning is over. Rome does not wait for tears." Cesare turned, his expression unreadable. "Nor does Rome forgive weakness, father. If we are to survive, we must strike first, strike harder than anyone dares imagine." Alexander studied him for a long moment. In Cesare, he saw the embodiment of his own ambition, a man unbound by morality, willing to carve out a new world with blood and fire. "You speak as though you were born for the sword," the Pope said. "I was," Cesare replied simply, tearing the crimson cardinal's sash from his shoulders and letting it fall to the floor. "These robes are a cage. I will not waste my life reciting prayers while others build empires." The decision was unprecedented. No cardinal had ever voluntarily renounced his title. The Vatican was stunned, but Alexander, far from condemning his son, secretly facilitated the transition. Through intricate negotiations with France, Cesare gained military backing. King Louis XII, seeking papal approval for an annulment, struck a bargain. Cesare would marry a French princess and receive an army in return for political support. Soon, Cesare rode at the head of glittering columns of French cavalry, his black armor gleaming beneath banners emblazoned with the Borgia crest. Town after town fell before his calculated brutality. Assassinations silenced rivals. Sieges broke rebellious cities. His campaign in Romagna transformed him into one of the most feared warlords in Europe. Observers marveled at his efficiency. Niccolò Machiavelli, then a Florentine diplomat, would later immortalize Cesare in The Prince, admiring his ability to inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure. "Better to be feared than loved," Cesare once told his lieutenants, his voice calm as he surveyed the bodies of executed rebels swinging from the city gates. "Love fades. Fear endures." But this glory came at a staggering cost. The Vatican treasury bled gold to fund Cesare's campaigns. Alexander resorted to increasingly desperate measures. Selling indulgences, auctioning church offices, even creating new cardinals whose families paid exorbitant fees for the honor. Salvation itself had become a commodity. Section 6. Lucrezia's Chains. While Cesare carved his empire with sword and fire, his sister Lucrezia played a quieter but no less dangerous role. Blonde-haired, graceful, and cunning, she was the perfect pawn for her father's political marriages. Her first union, to Giovanni Sforza, had been arranged to cement an alliance with the powerful Sforza family. But when the political winds shifted, Alexander abruptly annulled the marriage, claiming, falsely, that Giovanni was impotent. Humiliated, Giovanni fled Rome, whispering dark accusations that the Pope himself had taken his daughter as a lover. Lucrezia bore these rumors with outward serenity, though inside she burned with anger. She had never been free to choose her own path. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, briefly brought her happiness. Alfonso was handsome, kind, and genuinely devoted to her. But Cesare viewed him as a threat to his ambitions. One summer evening, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Though he survived the initial assault, Cesare's assassins finished the job days later, strangling him in his sickbed. Lucrezia's screams echoed through the corridors of the Vatican as she clung to her husband's lifeless body. She confronted Cesare in a private chamber, her golden hair disheveled, her face streaked with tears. "You murdered him!" she cried, her voice trembling with fury. "He was innocent, Cesare. He was mine!" Cesare's expression remained icy. "He was an obstacle. And obstacles are removed. That is the way of power. You speak of power as if it were worth the cost of your soul." She spat. Cesare stepped closer, lowering his voice to a deadly whisper. "We have no souls, Lucrezia. Not in this game. Only victories and graves." From that day forward, Lucrezia's heart hardened. Though still a pawn in her father's schemes, she began to cultivate her own network of allies, mastering the art of deception. Behind her angelic smile, she learned to hide daggers. Section 7. The Vatican of Masks. By the turn of the century, the Vatican was no longer a holy sanctuary but a fortress of corruption. Pilgrims still flocked to Rome, kissing the worn steps of basilicas and offering prayers beneath glittering mosaics. But beneath this veneer of piety, the papal court seethed with vice. Cardinals attended secret banquets where political alliances were forged over platters of exotic delicacies. Ambassadors exchanged bribes like greetings. Every decision, from the appointment of a bishop to the declaration of war, carried a price in gold. The papal apartments themselves became a stage for elaborate entertainments. Musicians played beneath vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of saints and angels, their divine gazes contrasting starkly with the debauchery unfolding below. Pope Alexander VI reveled in these spectacles. Age had not dulled his appetite for pleasure. His mistress, Julia Farnese, moved through the halls like a goddess, her laughter echoing against marble walls. Her presence was so accepted that she often attended official ceremonies beside the Pope, scandalizing foreign dignitaries. For many within the Vatican, participation in these gatherings was a survival tactic. To decline an invitation was to risk suspicion, or worse. Those who resisted the Borgia regime often met untimely ends, their deaths ruled as accidents or divine judgment. It was within this atmosphere of decadence and fear that Cesare conceived his most infamous display of power, the Banquet of Chestnuts. Though its exact purpose remains debated, many believed it was intended as a loyalty test, a way to bind Rome's elite to the Borgias through shared guilt and blackmail. Section 8. The Night of the Banquet. The night was cool and still, the Vatican cloaked in mist that curled around its ancient stones like ghostly fingers. Inside Cesare's apartments, hundreds of candles blazed, their light reflecting off gold leaf and polished marble. The air was thick with incense, mingling with the scent of spiced wine and roasted meats. 50 courtesans, chosen for their beauty and skill, waited in an adjoining chamber. Their gowns shimmered like liquid jewels, each carefully designed to tantalize. They whispered nervously among themselves, aware that tonight's performance would be unlike any other. Cesare himself stood at the center of the grand hall, dressed in black velvet embroidered with silver. His dark eyes swept over the assembled guests, cardinals, noblemen, diplomats from across Europe. His voice carried easily over the murmurs. "Tonight," he declared, "we honor victory, loyalty, and the power of truth unmasked. Here, there are no titles, no pretenses, only desire." Beside him sat Pope Alexander VI, his aged face flushed with anticipation. To his left was Lucrezia, her expression serene but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. None could say whether she attended willingly or under duress. The feast began with courses of rare delicacies: roasted peacock, honeyed figs, spice boar. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and inhibitions. As the final platters were cleared, the music shifted to a haunting, sensual rhythm. The courtesans entered, moving like a living wave of silk and perfume. Their dance began modestly, but as the evening progressed, layers of clothing were discarded until their bodies gleamed in the candlelight. The guests watched, entranced, as the boundary between entertainment and obscenity dissolved. Then came the chestnuts. Servants scattered them across the marble floor, their glossy shells glinting in the flickering light. The courtesans dropped to their hands and knees, crawling to collect them while the guests roared with laughter and wagers were placed on their speed and grace. Pope Alexander raised his goblet high, his voice booming above the chaos. "Let the games begin!" Section 9. The Contest of Sin. As the courtesans gathered the last of the chestnuts, Cesare signaled for silence. His voice, low and commanding, filled the hall. "Now let us see which of you," he said, glancing at the male guests, "possesses not only courage but stamina. The prize will be glory, and a gift from the Pope himself." The rules were announced, a competition to see which guest could bed the greatest number of courtesans before dawn. Servants stood ready to tally the results, their faces expressionless. Some guests hesitated, their faces pale with shame. Others laughed boisterously and stripped off their finery, eager to prove themselves. The Vatican, a place once consecrated to prayer, had become a brothel. Lucrezia rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Enough," she said sharply, her voice trembling. "This is madness." Alexander's gaze snapped to her, cold and sharp. "Sit down, daughter." Her lips parted as though to protest, but Cesare's hand touched her arm, his grip iron. "Do not speak," he murmured. "Not here. Not now." The contest began. Cries of pleasure and humiliation echoed through the hall. Gold coins and jewels changed hands as bets were placed. The Pope watched it all with a rapturous smile, as though presiding over a sacred rite. Beneath the column where you hid, your stomach churned with revulsion. This was no mere debauchery. It was a deliberate act of desecration, a message to all who oppose the Borgias: we rule even your souls. Section 10. The morning after. Dawn crept over Rome, pale and cold. Within Cesare's apartments, the revelry lay scattered like the aftermath of a battlefield. Spilled wine stained the marble floors. Courtesans slept in tangled heaps. Guests stumbled away, their faces hollow with exhaustion and shame. Alexander VI appeared at morning mass as though nothing had occurred, his robes immaculate, his expression serene. To the pilgrims kneeling before him, he was the holy shepherd of Christendom. None guessed what sins those hands had blessed only hours before. But rumors spread swiftly through Rome. Servants whispered, guards gossiped, and ambassadors sent secret reports to their masters. By week's end, the scandal was known throughout Europe. Even courts accustomed to decadence were horrified. In Florence, the preacher Savonarola thundered from the pulpit, "Behold the whore of Babylon! The papal throne itself is corrupted! Repent, or face the wrath of God!" Reformers seized upon the story as proof that the Church was beyond redemption. Martin Luther, still a young monk in Germany, would one day cite such corruption as fuel for his rebellion. Yet within the Vatican, the Borgias thrived. Alexander ignored the outrage, pouring resources into Cesare's campaigns. For every enemy disgusted by their sins, a dozen more were bound by fear or greed. But the seeds of destruction had been sown. The Banquet of Chestnuts would not be forgotten. Section 11. The Fall of a Dynasty. 2 years later, in the sweltering heat of August 1503, Pope Alexander VI fell ill. Some whispered of poison, others of malaria. His skin turned ashen, his body racked with fever. Cesare, too, was struck down, though he recovered. On August 18th, the Vicar of Christ breathed his last. Rome erupted into chaos. Rival families, long suppressed by Borgia power, rose in rebellion. Cesare, weakened and without his father's protection, saw his empire crumble. He fled to Spain, where, 4 years later, he died in battle, cut down not as a prince, but as a common mercenary. Lucrezia, exiled through marriage to Ferrara, lived out her days in uneasy peace. Though she ruled wisely and earned the love of her people, the shadow of her family's sins never left her. The apartments where the Banquet of Chestnuts had been held were abandoned. Pope Julius II, Alexander's successor, refused to set foot in them. Instead, he commissioned Raphael to paint new frescoes above, covering the rot with beauty. But beneath the paint, the stones remembered. Section 12. Legacy of the Chestnuts. Centuries passed, yet the story endured. Scholars debated the details. Some claimed Burchard's account, preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, was exaggerated or forged. Others insisted it was truth too terrible to deny. Regardless of its exact form, the Banquet of Chestnuts became a symbol, a cautionary tale of power unrestrained by faith. The Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the very shape of modern Europe, all were shaped, in part, by that night of sin. Even today, when tourists wander through the Vatican's grand halls, they marvel at the art and architecture. Few realize that beneath their feet, in shadowed rooms now hidden from view, history's most infamous orgy once unfolded. And somewhere, perhaps, the ghosts of those who crawled for chestnuts beneath flickering candles still whisper their warnings. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. Final section. Ashes of Power. The sun rose over Rome like a pale ghost, its light washing the city in hues of gold and crimson. From the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, the bells tolled with solemnity, their chimes echoing through narrow streets where vendors hawked bread and pilgrims shuffled on weary feet. To the world beyond the Vatican's towering walls, it was simply another morning of worship and commerce. Yet beneath the marble floors of the Holy See, the shadow of the Banquet of Chestnuts lingered, its memory festering like a wound that would never fully heal. Pope Alexander VI had mastered the art of illusion. In public, he appeared as the devout shepherd of Christendom, his hands raised in blessing, his voice resonant with prayers. Behind closed doors, however, those same hands had orchestrated a night so blasphemous it would echo through the centuries. The Vatican had been transformed into a stage for degradation, with 50 courtesans, noblemen, and cardinals reduced to pawns in Cesare Borgia's deadly game of loyalty and fear. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with rumors. Servants whispered in darkened corridors. Ambassadors wrote urgent letters sealed with trembling hands. Some details grew more lurid with each retelling, yet the core truth remained undeniable. The Pope himself had presided over a spectacle of lust and power, watching as Rome's elite crawled for chestnuts like beasts. Even the staunchest defenders of the Church struggled to explain away such depravity. For a brief moment, Alexander faltered. In a rare private conversation with Lucrezia, he confessed his unease. "Do you think me damned, my daughter?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Lucrezia, her golden hair veiled in mourning black, studied him with cold eyes. She had seen her husband murdered, her freedom bartered, her very name dragged through filth. "Father," she said at last, "you damned yourself long ago. The only question is how much more of the world you will drag down with you." Cesare, by contrast, thrived in the scandal's aftermath. While foreign courts condemned the Borgias, their fear only deepened his power. Blackmail became his sharpest weapon, for those who had participated in the banquet dared not speak against him lest their own sins be revealed. He rode out once more with his armies, his banners black and crimson, carving new territories into his personal kingdom. Machiavelli himself observed him in awe, later writing. If fortune had not turned against him, Cesare Borgia would have been the perfect prince. But fortune is fickle. In August 1503, Rome sweltered under a relentless heat when illness struck the papal household. Alexander VI fell suddenly, violently sick after a banquet meant to celebrate yet another political victory. Some whispered of malaria, others of poison, perhaps even a dish intended for Cesare himself, for enemies surrounded them on every side. As the Pope's body weakened, the grandeur of his reign crumbled like dust. On August 18, Alexander VI died, his bloated corpse so repulsive that attendants fled the chamber rather than prepare it for burial. Rome erupted into chaos. Rival families rose in rebellion, tearing down Borgia emblems and slaughtering loyalists. Cesare, stricken with fever and grief, staggered through the wreckage of his ambitions. Without his father's protection, his empire dissolved in days. Desperate, Cesare fled to Spain, seeking refuge and revenge. But there, far from the marble halls of the Vatican, his destiny ended not as a prince but as a mercenary. In 1507, During a skirmish against rebellious peasants, he was surrounded and cut down. His body lay mutilated in the mud, a grim reminder that even the mightiest fall. Lucrezia, married off to the Duke of Ferrara, survived her family's ruin. In Ferrara, she rebuilt her reputation, ruling wisely and earning the love of her people. Yet even as she prayed in her private chapel, she could never fully escape the whispers of her father's sins, of her brother's crimes, of that night when the Vatican became Babylon. Pope Julius II, Alexander's successor, refused to inhabit the Borgia apartments. The rooms where the Banquet of Chestnuts had unfolded were abandoned, their frescoes darkened with age. Raphael was commissioned to paint new chambers above them, filling the walls with visions of divine harmony, as though art itself could erase the memory of corruption. But beneath the paint and plaster, the stones remembered. The Banquet of Chestnuts became legend. Scholars argued over the details, some claiming Johann Burchard, the meticulous papal master of ceremonies, had exaggerated or invented the tale. Yet his dry, clinical Latin diary survived, sealed in the Vatican's secret archives. When later generations read his words, their faces blanched, for no exaggeration was needed to convey the truth. Centuries later, Martin Luther would strike his hammer against the church door in Wittenberg, igniting the Protestant Reformation. Though he never saw Rome, the stories of Alexander VI's reign fueled his fury. The idea that the Pope, the very vicar of Christ, could preside over such depravity gave reformers their most powerful weapon, proof that the institution was rotting from within. And so, from that single night of chestnuts and shame, the world shifted. Wars were fought, kingdoms fell, new faiths were born. The Vatican itself reformed, cloaking its rituals in even greater splendor to hide the scars of its past. The Counter-Reformation's glittering pageantry was, in truth, an elaborate mask meant to assure the faithful that such corruption would never happen again. Today, tourists wander the Vatican's halls, marveling at Raphael's frescoes and Michelangelo's soaring dome. They see only beauty, unaware that beneath their feet lie hidden chambers where history's darkest feast once took place. The chestnuts were swept away before dawn, the courtesans vanished into anonymity, and the marble was scrubbed clean. But no cleansing can erase the stain of memory. Power, like fire, illuminates and destroys. Alexander VI believed himself untouchable, his family destined to rule forever. Yet, in the end, his empire crumbled to ashes, and his name became a curse. The Banquet of Chestnuts endures not merely as a tale of sin, but as a mirror held up to all ages. It reminds us that beneath crowns and mitres, beneath vestments and titles, men remain fallible, driven by the same hungers that once filled those Vatican halls with laughter and screams. As the final echoes of the bells fade into silence, one truth remains unchanging: when power escapes the bounds of morality, even the holiest places can become dens of corruption. And though the chestnuts are long gone, their shadow still lingers, scattered across the floors of history, waiting for another generation to stumble upon them, and to choose whether to repeat the sins of the past, or to finally break free from their grip.